I was recently at a clean energy summit, standing in a hall filled with sleek, silent electric vehicle prototypes and shimmering solar panels. I struck up a conversation with an engineer who was practically radiant with optimism. He showed me a series of complex charts on his tablet, pointing out the inevitable death spiral of the fossil fuel industry. To him, oil was already a ghost, a dirty 20th century relic that was finally being purged from the global system. He kept using the word obsolete with kind of giddy satisfaction, as if we were just weeks away from a world powered entirely by the wind and the sun. But then, I asked him a single grounded question. How do you plan to charge a division of 60-ton tanks in the middle of a combat zone where the power grid has been leveled? The shift was instantaneous. His face didn't just fall, it went blank. He started to mention portable hydrogen or tactical solar arrays, but his voice trailed off as he realized the sheer physics of the problem. That fervent green certainty evaporated, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. It was the look of someone who had spent years perfecting a beautiful theory, only to realize they'd forgotten to account for the most brutal reality of human history. That moment of realization is exactly what we are missing in our public discourse. We've become comfortable framing oil through the lens of climate policy, gas prices, or the latest EV tax credit. It's a clean civilian debate. But behind the press releases and the green rhetoric, there is a much older, much darker logic at play. Great powers aren't obsessed with oil because they're behind the times or stubborn. They are obsessed because war is and has always been about movement. And in a world that has been plunged into chaos, movement doesn't come from a charging station or a moral stance. It comes from liquid fuel. When you strip away the branding of energy security, you're left with a truth no one likes to say out loud. Oil isn't about the economy. It's about who moves, who strikes, and who survives when the peace ends.
Wow. Yeah, that completely sets the stage for what we are getting into today.
Right. I wanted to start by reading that passage exactly as it was written in one of our core documents today, because it just perfectly frames the mission of this deep dive. So welcome in, everyone. Today, we are taking you on a deep dive into the absolute uncompromising military reliance on liquid fuel. We're peeling back that civilian rhetoric around energy to look at the raw geopolitics of it.
Yeah, and we've got a really fascinating mix of materials for you today. We're pulling from academic analyses on petroaggression, detailed military logistics reports from the RAND Corporation, historical policies like the Carter Doctrine, and some really raw personal field accounts.
And just to be super clear right up front, some of the source material touches on politically charged topics, green energy, climate policy, foreign interventions. We are not taking any political sides here. We're just impartially breaking down the strategic and logistical realities that these documents present.
Exactly. Our goal is just to convey the ideas from the sources, not endorse them. We're looking at the physical reality of the battlefield, which is so disconnected from civilian energy debates.
Right, because the civilian sector looks at a giant battery and sees the future. But the military looks at a kinetic environment where the infrastructure is literally the first thing to get blown up, and they see a massive liability.
Yeah, in military logistics, this concept is actually formally known as the tyranny of energy.
The tyranny of energy.
It's very accurate. It's essentially a mathematical trap. The heavier your combat vehicles are, and the further they need to go, the bigger the target you paint on your own logistics chain.
Because vehicle propulsion just demands massive amounts of energy, right?
Right, and it doesn't matter if that energy is stored in liquid fuel or a battery or hydrogen. The physics remain the same.
So let's break down that math for a second, just to give you a concrete example of what this tyranny actually looks like around.
Sure. So look at the M10 Booker combat vehicle. It's a relatively new addition to armored formations. And a key thing to note is that it's an additive system.
Meaning it doesn't replace an old vehicle, it just gets added to the total fleet.
Exactly. So the footprint just grows. The M10 weighs roughly 40 tons. Now, for just one M10 Booker to travel 150 to 200 kilometers, which, by the way, is its approximate cross-country range.
Which really isn't that far in the grand scheme of things.
But just to go that distance, it requires the energy equivalent of 5.5 barrels of crude oil.
Okay, 5.5 barrels. Now, on paper, if you're just looking at a spreadsheet, that doesn't sound like a world-ending amount of fuel for a major military.
No, it doesn't. But here's where the tyranny really kicks in. That fuel doesn't just magically teleport to the front line.
Right.
Those 5.5 barrels have to be procured, stored, and then physically driven across hostile territory. So you put the fuel into a transport truck.
And that truck is heavy.
And it's burning fuel simply to move the fuel for the M10.
Oh. And a slow-moving truck filled with, highly combustible liquid is basically the single most attractive target you could possibly put on a battlefield.
Exactly. Which means you can't send it out there alone. You have to assign armored escort vehicles just to protect the fuel convoy.
Those escorts are burning fuel too.
So suddenly, to deliver 5.5 barrels of oil to one single combat vehicle, you are burning an exponentially larger amount of fuel just to sustain the delivery mechanism itself.
It's just a compounding logistical nightmare.
It is.
Plus, we aren't even just talking about making the tank tracks roll anymore. The electrical demand inside these vehicles is just skyrocketing.
Absolutely. The onboard systems are incredibly power hungry now.
Right. You've got modern command and control networks, constant satellite comms, intel gathering equipment, and even directed energy weapons. The sheer electrical draw of a modern combat unit has grown tenfold over the last few decades.
And militaries know this. They are actively trying to adapt to this huge surge in demand. There are actual strategic plans out there to deploy fully electric non-tactical vehicles by 2027.
Okay.
And they want hybrid tactical vehicles by 2035.
In 2035 for hybrid tactical vehicles.
Yeah.
Isn't the whole premise of what we're talking about that electricity and fragile grids just absolutely do not work in a kinetic war zone? If the grid is leveled, how on earth does a hybrid combat vehicle solve anything?
That is the critical distinction here. The main reason the military is trying to electrify ground platforms isn't about environmental sustainability. It's entirely about unlocking new combat capabilities.
So
it's about reducing the logistical tether. A hybrid engine gives a vehicle an extended silent watch mode.
silent watch mode.
Yeah, basically a tank can sit in an overwatch position, shut off its really loud heat-generating diesel engine, and just run its sensors and comms entirely off the battery.
Oh, which drastically reduces its acoustic signature.
And its thermal signature, yeah.
Yep.
It makes the vehicle so much harder for enemy sensors to detect. So it increases stealth, it lengthens mission times, and it consumes less fuel overall.
Which means fewer of those vulnerable fuel convoys having to brave the supply routes.
Exactly. And fewer convoys directly translates to fewer casualties. But you're totally right. The reality of combat charging is still this massive unresolved hurdle. A battery still needs a source to charge it.
Right. Which actually brings us to this incredibly stark field account from the materials.
Oh, the logistics officer story.
So there's this report about a young logistics officer stationed at a forward operating base. And this is in a super remote, arid region where the ambient heat is practically as dangerous as the enemy.
Brutal condition.
Yeah. And this officer was put in charge of maintaining a specialized fleet of experimental electric reconnaissance vehicles. The whole initiative was designed to lower the, quote, carbon footprint of the occupation.
Which is just a classic collision of civilian policy mandates meeting tactical reality.
It was a disaster waiting to happen. Every afternoon, as the sun just hammered the sand, their charging infrastructure would start to falter. They were relying on these fragile solar arrays and big, bulky battery banks.
Which do not handle extreme weather well.
The geography was just relentless. Daily dust storms would come in and completely coat the solar panels, which ruined their efficiency.
Right.
And then the extreme thermal load from the heat was rapidly degrading the battery storage.
Because in a connected environment, environmental interference isn't just an inconvenience, it's a critical failure.
And that critical failure actually happened. One evening, an urgent medical evacuation call comes in from a nearby ridge. Personnel were wounded. They needed immediate extraction.
High stakes.
Life or death. So the officer rushes out to dispatch the vehicles, but the entire green reconnaissance fleet is sitting there completely dead, tethered to these failing chargers. Their batteries were drained by the climate, and the nearest functioning power grid was 1,000 miles away.
It just proves that the technology, no matter how advanced it is completely useless without the dense energy required to actually run it.
Useless. The extraction was only saved because they had an old, oil-gulping turboprop engine and a heavy diesel-powered transport truck. The officer described watching the liquid fuel being poured from a simple plastic jerry can.
A literal lifesaver.
Yeah, because it was portable, it was chemically stable, and it was dense with enough physical energy to just defy the elements. In that moment, for that officer, the ideological beauty of the energy transition just vanished.
Imagine.
They noted that the smell of the diesel exhaust wasn't pollution. It was the smell of a heartbeat. It was literally the only mechanism keeping the mission alive when the grid was dead.
You know, it operates on the exact same logic as having the world's most advanced, most expensive satellite phone, but you're lost out in the wilderness with a dead battery and no charger.
Analogy.
The sophistication of the hardware means absolutely nothing without the underlying power source. Only in the military context, a dead battery doesn't mean you just miss a phone call. It means a failed medical evacuation. It means casualties.
Yeah, that story just underscores the uncompromising physics of the battlefield. Reliability is the only currency that matters. And liquid fuel is the lifeblood, because it's energy you can carry in a jug across a desert.
Right. But, if liquid fuel is the heartbeat of tactical survival on the ground, then securing the massive oceans that deliver it is the grand strategy of empires. We really have to shift our focus from the dirt of the forward operating base out to the high seas, because you cannot separate tactical logistics from global naval strategy.
Right, because the logistics chain that ends with that jerrycan in the desert has to begin with securing global transit routes.
Exactly. And a prime example of this is the Strait of Hormuz. It is this narrow, highly congested geographical choke point, and roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through it every single day.
20 million barrels. Just to put that in perspective for you listening, that represents about 20% of total global daily consumption, passing through one narrow strait.
And the uninterrupted flow of that specific resource is so structurally vital to the entire world order that it forms the explicit basis of foreign policy.
Which brings us to the Carter Doctrine.
Yes. The Carter Doctrine of 1980 is probably the clearest articulation of this reality. It stated unequivocally that any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as a direct assault on the vital interests of the United States.
And the response wouldn't just be sanctions.
No, the doctrine explicitly stated that such an assault would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
And we really have to look to the historical trigger for that doctrine. It didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was a direct response to the Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan in 1970.
Right.
By pushing into Afghanistan, Soviet military forces positioned themselves within, 300 miles of the Indian Ocean. They were getting dangerously close to the Straits of Hormuz.
And that proximity was a strategic threat of the highest possible order. People frequently misunderstand the deployment of military resources to this region over the decades.
Yeah, it's framed a lot as a corporate thing.
Exactly. It has never been an exercise in protecting corporate oil profits or ensuring high quarterly returns for big energy companies. It has always been a strategic, existential imperative to prevent any hostile actor from dominating the market and cutting off the lifeblood of allied militaries.
The tanker wars in the 1980s are a perfect example of this. The U.S. didn't just issue angry diplomatic letters, they launched Operation Earnest Will.
The
U.S. Navy actively reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers and provided heavy military escorts right through the Persian Gulf just to ensure the oil kept moving.
And when the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine in the Gulf, the response was immediate and overwhelming.
That was Operation Praying Mantis, right?
Yes. Naval forces systematically destroyed Iranian oil platforms and sank a significant portion of their operational navy. The objective was absolute. It was the physical protection of the transit routes. They were enforcing the reality that the oil must flow or devastating force will be applied.
I was reading through the declassified archives while prepping for this, and there was this personal memoir from a former naval strategist.
Yeah.
He spent decades operating in those tanker war corridors in the Middle East.
Oh, his account is fascinating.
He described this one specific memory. It was a quiet evening. He's standing on the deck of a destroyer in the Strait of Hormuz, just watching this endless procession of massive supertankers silhouetted against the sunset.
What a visual.
Yeah. And he wrote that to the civilian world, those were just commercial vessels carrying a commodity to keep gas prices low at the pump. But to him, looking through a strategic lens, they were the moving geography of global power.
Moving geography. That is a highly accurate framing.
He realized that the naval presence there had nothing to do with domestic consumption. It was about the invisible tether between those steel hulls in the Gulf and the combat readiness of every airbase in Europe and every carrier strike group in the Pacific. He called it the strategic calculus. It was this deep understanding that if those arteries were severed, the most advanced military in human history would immediately become a collection of very expensive, very stationary museum pieces.
They'd be paralyzed.
Yeah. His job wasn't to defend big business. His job was to defend the global oxygen of military mobility.
And that strategic calculus forces a very common, very critical question that we hear all the time. If a nation like the U.S. produces a massive amount of its own oil domestically, why does it still maintain such an absolute obsession with projecting naval power in regions like the Middle East?
Yeah, it seems super contradictory on the surface. If you have the oil at home, why guard the oil across the globe?
The answer lies in the fundamental nature of war planning. War planning is never, ever based on the mechanics of peacetime domestic supply. It is entirely about control under extreme stress.
Okay.
It is about determining who gets the oil during a global kinetic conflict, and crucially, who gets cut off first.
Because the global oil market is entirely fungible, right?
Right.
A barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. So a disruption anywhere instantly causes a massive crisis everywhere.
Exactly. And if we connect this global naval strategy back to the landmasses themselves, it reveals the severe human and geopolitical cost for the actual countries sitting on top of those reserves.
It's a heavy burden.
It's a devastating burden. If controlling the flow of oil is the ultimate strategic lever for global superpowers, the states producing the oil bear the brunt of that tension. In international relations, this dynamic is known as petroaggression.
We really need to explain the mechanics behind petroaggression for you listening. How exactly does pulling a valuable resource out of the ground structurally change a country and make it more aggressive?
Well, it alters the fundamental social contract between a government and its citizens. Normally, a state functions based on taxation, right? The government needs revenue to operate, build roads, maintain an army. To get that revenue, it must tax the population.
Right.
And because the citizens are financially supporting the state, they inherently demand a degree of accountability and representation. If a leader wants to initiate a massive, costly war, they have to convince the taxpayers to fund it.
Because it's their money and their lives on the line. Citizens generally resist funding wars that don't directly threaten their survival.
But when a state sits on massive oil reserves, that entire mechanism is completely bypassed.
Yeah.
The government doesn't need to heavily tax its citizens because it draws vast revenue directly from resource extraction, usually by selling oil to foreign markets.
So the state achieves complete financial autonomy from its own people.
Exactly. The leader no longer needs the financial consent of the population, and this domestic autonomy drastically lowers the political risks of instigating conflicts.
Just blank check.
It frequently funds aggressive, highly risky foreign policies because the leadership faces zero internal financial pushback. And historical data consistently reinforces this concept. Revolutionary petrostates have a propensity for international conflict that is significantly higher than typical states.
Saddam Hussein is a textbook example of this from the sources. He utilized Iraq's immense oil income to heavily centralize his power, bypass domestic opposition entirely, and build a massive, sprawling military apparatus.
And then he used it.
He used that apparatus to invade Iran in 1980 and later Kuwait in 1990.
And Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya followed a very similar trajectory. He utilized extraordinary oil wealth to fund 4 separate, protracted border wars with neighboring Chad, alongside numerous militarized disputes with other nations across the region.
It's like oil acts as a powerful magnet for violence.
It externalizes civil wars and provides the limitless finances necessary to sustain long-term insurgencies.
The Angolan Civil War perfectly illustrates how this magnet operates. That conflict was heavily and brutally financed by natural resources. You had the central government controlling the offshore oil industry, while the rebel factions controlled the inland diamond mining operations.
It was a conflict fueled entirely by the extraction of localized wealth. And because those resources were so incredibly valuable, it drew in direct military interventions from outside powers.
Right. Cuba, the Soviet Union, South Africa, they all became involved, pouring weapons and personnel into the country.
The resource wealth prolonged the bloodshed by decades. It escalated a domestic power struggle into a massive international proxy war.
Which actually brings us to a deeply personal perspective on this whole geopolitical chessboard. I was watching a video interview with a seasoned refinery engineer from the source materials.
That interview was heartbreaking.
He lived in a country that sits atop one of the world's largest oil reserves, a region that has basically become a perennial battleground for global powers. And he had worked at the exact same refining facility for 40 years.
4 decades.
Yeah. Over those 4 decades, he watched his workplace transition from a symbol of national prosperity into a primary target in a devastating proxy conflict.
And the descent into conflict is rarely sudden, right? There are always indicators.
And he detailed exactly that. He described the quiet war that happens long before the first bombs are actually dropped.
The logistical preparations.
Exactly. It started with subtle shifts in the market. International shipping insurance rates for vessels entering their ports suddenly spiked. Then came the sudden, unannounced withdrawal of foreign technical advisors and engineers.
They just packed up and left.
Yeah. Finally, he observed the rapid buildup of strategic reserves in neighboring hostile states.
Those are the clear signs of preparation for a sustained kinetic engagement.
And then the reality finally arrived at his doorstep. He watched as his civilian refinery was systematically transformed into a military fortress. High walls, anti-aircraft batteries, armed garrisons.
And it wasn't to protect him.
No, it wasn't fortified to protect the workers inside at all. It was fortified to protect the war preparedness of whichever military faction could hold the gates. He realized, after 40 years, that his home wasn't truly a sovereign country anymore.
No.
It was merely a fueling station in a global game of chess.
Because the output of that specific refinery determined which army had the stamina to fight a long-term war, and which army would just run out of fuel and collapse within weeks.
It's the ultimate tragic paradox. For this engineer, oil wasn't wealth, it was a curse. It was a resource so utterly vital to international security that its mere presence under the soil guaranteed his land would never know a simple, quiet peace. It just paints a giant, inescapable geopolitical bullseye on the borders. It turns basic civic infrastructure into a hard military objective.
The exact same resource that possesses the vast economic potential to build schools, modernize hospitals, and elevate a population instead forces a nation into a state of perpetual militarization. True international security remains incredibly fragile because the global defense mechanisms of every major superpower rely entirely on a highly volatile, geographically concentrated physical resource.
Exactly. We cannot view liquid fuel simply through the lens of consumer economics or civilian climate aspirations. We have traced the physical reality of this resource across the entire spectrum of conflict today. From the portable jerrycan ensuring a critical medical evacuation in the hot desert, to the massive tankers operating as the moving geography of global power in the Strait of Hormuz, to civilian refineries forcibly transformed into military fortresses. The control of liquid fuel dictates the fundamental physics of war. It serves as the absolute currency of global survival.
And as militaries around the world continue to pour billions of dollars into researching tactical solar grids and hybrid combat vehicles, it becomes clear that this effort is not an environmental awakening. It is the ultimate strategic maneuver. It is a highly calculated attempt to finally break free from the deadly, burdensome logistical tether of liquid fuel that dictates every single movement on the battlefield. The shift in global power will be absolute the day an army can march, fight, and win without ever needing to capture a single drop of oil.